Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. Today's episode marks the beginning of the second year of Encounters with Polish Literature. We started this series as a pandemic project, as a way to accomplish the Polish Cultural Institute's mission without being able to organize live public events, and it has taken on a life of its own. Most episodes attract about 300 to 500 views in the first month, with our Olga Tokarczuk episode standing out with about 900 or 1,000 views in the first month. Our first episode has had by now over 1,600 viewers, and each episode reaches a wider and wider audience with the passage of time. Many university professors have mentioned that they recommend our program or even assign it when teaching the authors that we cover. And based on this series, I've even been invited by an instructor whom I didn't previously know to speak about Witold Gombrowicz at a class on medical humanities, of all things, at an Ivy League university. Of course, students in Polish programs and Slavic departments are a big part of our core audience. But if we're introducing these authors to students and readers outside the Slavic field, that's what cultural diplomacy is all about. So our subject for today, Wisława Szymborska, was herself a fairly reclusive writer, really the opposite sort of persona to the great romantic poets of the 19th century like Mickiewicz or Słowacki, who created the mold of the poet as a national prophet in the era of the partitions when Poland did not exist as a political state. She cultivated interiority without self-indulgence, an interiority of space that reflected an interiority of the mind and of the emotions, but not of the ego, really. And yet, despite the seeming personal inaccessibility and inwardness, she's proven to be one of the most popular and accessible poets in the world. We don't follow her because she presents any kind of personal glamour or celebrity, but because of her words on the page. And that would seem to be who she wants to be. As readers, maybe we see some of our own inwardness and everyday life in the image of her inwardness and everyday life. Before we meet today's guest, I'd like to thank everyone who has been following along with Encounters with Polish Literature. If you like what you hear on this program, click the thumbs up down below. Ring the bell to get notifications about new episodes. Follow the playlist of all of our episodes in the YouTube description of the program down below. Leave a comment if you can, and please click the subscribe button to show the Polish Cultural Institute New York that you are interested and would like to hear more about Polish literature, its past and present, here on Encounters with Polish Literature. So our guest for today, Clare Cavanagh, works on 19th and 20th century Russian, Polish, and Anglo-American poetry, and she has published many monographs, books of translations, edited volumes, and has won many awards and fellowships that you can read about on the webpage for this episode on the Polish Cultural Institute New York website. Her book, Lyric Poetry in Modern Politics, Russia, Poland, and the West, received the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. She is an associate editor of the revised Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, which I always recommend to literature grad students preparing for their comprehensive exams. She is currently working on an authorized biography of the Nobel Prize winning poet Czesław Miłosz, under contract with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. She's an acclaimed translator of contemporary Polish poetry, especially for her work on Wisława Szymborska and Adam Zagajewski, whom we discussed in episode 4 of Encounters with Polish Literature. Her translation of Wisława Szymborska's Advice to Authors, How to Start Writing and When to Stop, Advice for Writers, just came out at the end of 2021 from New Directions. Welcome back, Clare. Good to have you back on the program.
Good to see you too. Nice to be virtually in Hawaii.
It's nice to have you virtually in Hawaii. It's not the winter in Chicago when it would be nice to be actually in Hawaii. So let's think about where Szymborska starts, right? I mean, she starts when is her earliest publication? In the mid to late 40s, yeah?
She wrote a collection that she never actually published, that's unpublished from the 40s. I've read through it. I translated a lot of it, and I don't mind having done it. But as a mutual friend of Szymborska's and mine said, none of this is Szymborska. That's why she never published it. She could have if she'd wanted to. She didn't. But the first official publication is 53. So, of course, during the relatively short-lived period of high Stalinism in Poland.
Right. Maybe we can look at one. You do have a few of those very early poems in Map, which is, I think, the most complete collection in English, collected in Last Poems. Maybe we can look at that first one, which is maybe the first one that starts to look like Szymborska. This is a very early poem. Once we had the world backwards and forwards.
That is one of the ones she published regularly, and that's what I was trying to follow in editing the book, is what she would have wanted in here. Anyhow, so this is very early. Once we had the world backwards and forwards. It was so small it fit in two clasped hands, so simple that a smile did to describe it, so common, like old truths echoing in prayers. History didn't greet us with triumphal fanfares. It flung dirty sand into our eyes. Ahead of us lay long roads leading nowhere, poisoned wells and bitter bread. Our wartime loot is knowledge of the world. It is so large, it fits in two clasped hands, so hard that a smile does to describe it, so strange, like old truths echoing in prayers.
What do you think she saw in that early work that felt like herself?
Something she does in this poem that's not typical is she talks about we. And what she's obviously talking about is the generation that spent what would have been high school and college instead under Nazi occupation or Soviet occupation during the war. So the we isn't typical, but what is really her, I think, and something you see in one of her super famous early poems, Nothing Twice, is things get repeated, but they're not the same. And the repetition and transformation between the first stanza and the last. At first, we knew what it was all about. Everything could be encapsulated in two hands. The second stanza, that second stanza is the war. And that's like her too, hyper compression and not specific really at all, not personal experience. What do they know about the world? They've lived through the war. What do they know? Well, at first it was so small, it fit in two clasped hands. Now it's so large. There's the paradox that's built into that about knowledge and experience. That seems so Szymborska-like to me. So hard, so simple, so hard that a smile does to describe it, so strange that things that did seem common now are strange, that things that seemed summarizable, containable, capturable are now beyond capture, but we still kind of have them. They're infinite mystery. And that, I think, she ends the poem with paradoxes that can't quite be explained, which is the antithesis of what she did when she was trying her damnedest to be a true believer in poetry and presumably in life as well, as a young woman.
When she was young, she was committed to the party. I mean, she was, and she comes in for a lot of criticism for that. Although she later totally rejected that, and she didn't want those early Stalinist poems published. They largely, maybe you have a few references to them somewhere, but
I have references, but I never. Life is short.
Right. Why
translate that? Plus, she didn't want them retranslated, and this is something people should understand: is collected poems and complete poems are two different things. And collected poems, which are frequently, whenever possible, done during the lifetime of the poet decides where she or he actually began. They toss out the juvenilia, they toss out the stuff that were their 5-finger exercises, or in this case, she tosses out an ideology that to her is as mistaken in life as it is in poetry. And the poems, I mean, I have let me see if I can find a few of the titles here. I know I did make a list of titles, because you learn as much from her titles as you do from, oh, sorry, I had that just a moment ago.
Well, some of them are pretty straightforward. I mean, there's one Lenin about Lenin's grave, and
right, yeah, and I do have
Lenin laying the foundation of the future society, and then there's one
right,
called,
and that they're going to, in the future, we'll make it to Lenin. People from other planets will be laying flowers on Lenin's grave or something.
Right. Yeah, that's
it's really bad sort of Marxist-Leninist poetry, which
yeah, and there's the one that day about Stalin's death, which a number of very respectable writers wrote about. I mean, because you couldn't not, right? I mean, you couldn't not write about, if you were in the if you were a journalist, if you were a columnist, if you were writing in those days, then it was just obligatory, I think, in 1953 to write about Stalin's death.
And this is something else she writes about, is the dangers of hindsight. To make the story, to uncomplicate the story, to tell it in a straight line. A lot of good, interesting writers, as well as some drecky ones, of course, especially those who lived through the war, were looking for something to hang on to when it seemed like every pre-war value they had been destabilized. Any faith in the West had been radically undermined by the West's failure to stand by its designated ally, Poland, and to sort of hand over Poland to Stalin's quote unquote sphere of influence after the war. You want to believe in something, and you just exclude everything that doesn't fit. It's what sort of fundamentalist vision is about, and it helps you understand where that might be coming from. This is somebody who should have been a smart, if maybe a little bit flaky college student, too many interests all over the place, who instead got her education in the war, like so many others. The period that would have been her period of education was wartime Poland. Later, she says in one of her very few public pronouncements that the only reason she doesn't regret that episode is it taught her about the dangers of being a true believer. And she uses at one point the analogy of Charlie Chaplin in one of his movies is trying to pack everything into a trunk. You can't get everything in the trunk, so you just snip off everything that doesn't fit. So I think for her, the mature poetry begins where she stops snipping and says, the stuff that doesn't fit, that's what interests me. I'm going to change poetic form to make the odds and ends of human experience key to the experience and not outside some sort of pre-programmed view of what that experience ought to be.
That seems to happen around Calling Out to Yeti, which she regards as her debut, right? Her poetic debut, when she becomes, for herself, a real poet. Which is all of it translated, or most of it, I think?
I think pretty much all of it. Stanisław and I didn't do some in the first time we did a collected poems. And then I went back and Stanisław
Baranczak, the scholar and poet. we should introduce.
Yeah, Calling Out to Yeti is complete here. It wasn't in our first version, and I put in the poems that Stanisław and I hadn't done. He was really ill, and then it already passed by this time this came out, so I was doing it on my own, but sort of with him as my good translatorly angel. As I was doing it. So they're all here. Yeah. This was the time when she was changing positions, where she was starting to, Calling Out to Yeti may be a good example, because you're talking about the thaw, and she's in a way encouraging Yeti to get off his iceberg, to come down from the heights. So maybe we should do that one?
Yeah, let's do that one. You want to do notes from a non-existent Himalayan expedition?
She took her title from this poem, Notes from a Non-Existent Himalayan Expedition. So these are the Himalayas, mountains racing to the moon. The moment of their start recorded on the startling ripped canvas of the sky. Holes punched in a desert of clouds. Thrust into nothing. Echo. A white mute. Quiet. Yeti, down there we've got Wednesday, bread and alphabets. 2 times 2 is 4. Roses are red there and violets are blue. Yeti, crime is not all we're up to down there. Yeti, not every sentence there means death. We've inherited hope, the gift of forgetting. You'll see how we give birth among the ruins. Yeti, we've got Shakespeare there. Yeti, we play solitaire and violin. At nightfall, we turn lights on, Yeti. Up here, it's neither moon nor earth. Tears freeze. Oh, Yeti, semi-moon man, turn back, think again. I called this to the Yeti inside 4 walls of avalanche, stomping my feet for warmth on the everlasting snow.
And she said that at a later point, this was her political turning point, didn't she?
Yeah, and this is how it was read. It's been a while since I looked at them, but I think both Stanisław and Adam Zagajewski wrote essays about this volume at some point. It's in the collection about Radość czytania Szymborskiej, The Joy of Reading Szymborska, an anthology that was collected, is part of what they and she apparently saw in this was the person who sees himself as more than human, beyond human, living beyond the space where human beings actually dwell, kind of being Stalinist Superman, or even more than that, maybe just somebody who believes that their ideology has conquered the earth in a way, semi-moon man. So she's trying to lure the Yeti down. In Non-Existent is nice because that's something that's going to show up again and again. Her admiration for and curiosity about all the stuff we don't know and all the things we can't see and all the things that might have happened that didn't happen or that may happen that we'll never know happened, or that even the poem about the one day in her life that she knows happened because she somehow survived to the next day, but she can't remember a thing from it. So the varieties of nothingness. So she's celebrating imagination here. Imagination can create this kind of summons to a being who conceives of himself in the poem as beyond human. And celebrating down here, this is a really different kind of we than the we in the her True Believer phase poems, or even the very first one here. It's about all the silly stuff we've got down here. Wednesday, bread, alphabets. They're kind of building blocks. They're things you make stuff out of, but she's not talking about, we've got concepts of human time. We've created sustenance that's both symbolic and literal, roses are red and violets are blue. 2 times 2 is 4. It's truisms, but truisms are wonderful. Truisms are kind of the logic of daily life. Hope, give birth among the ruins. Well, you can see if you're reading this in 57, how much of Poland was still a ruin then, we know. But we still keep going somehow, and it's not based on ideology. We've inherited hope. This is like this little human gift that's been passed on, which is the gift, both a blessing and a curse. She explores this all the way into later poems like The End and the Beginning. You have to forget to keep going. Shakespeare and solitaire, it's a great pairing. Shakespeare's solitaire and violin. So from the sublime to the trivial, we turn lights on. So she's celebrating human ordinariness as an antidote to like the narratives that are so far above, the storylines and the beliefs that are so far above human experience that they've ceased to have any relationship to what's actually happening down here on Earth. So you can just see lots of her coming right out of this poem.
And it's also like, we were discussing this a little before our meeting today, which is that it's a kind of rejection of utopia, a rejection of the big, the grand narrative that's not human anymore. That's and
her poem Utopia is a perfect example of that. We don't need to do all the poems now, but where that's the land of impossibilities, and at the very end, all the footsteps are leading away, all the footprints in the sand are leading away. Utopia is where actual human beings escape from, not run to.
And maybe that explains something about she's a poet, which is a subject she deals with in her Nobel lecture, right? I mean, she talks about that poets are. She says at one point poets are unphotogenic, which is kind of actually untrue. I mean, one of the most famous photographs of poets is Johanna Hellender's photograph of her smoking the cigarette, which appears on many of her books and elsewhere. That the life of a poet must be boring. No one can call themselves a poet, but maybe this rejection of narrative explains to some degree why she becomes a poet.
This is something that I know really she was distraught about after the Nobel Prize. So much of her life was predicated on being ordinary and unrecognizable and just being some lady out with her little shopping bag, picking up the stuff and overhearing stuff in the line or living everyday life. Once she started getting recognized, she couldn't go, I'm not going to get the name right, but she even invented a genre that I think it's podsłuchanki.
Yeah.
I translated it as eavesdroppings, but you can't really do much with it, but it's just overheard everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to not have, you want to be, if you're her, you want to be unphotogenic. You don't want people taking your picture and recognizing you. And you don't want a life path that makes you deviate from the rest of not just humanity, but the people on your block. The people in your housing block.
It's an interesting genre. I mean, I think I know I have a certain take a certain pleasure in writing down things that I overhear, and Różewicz wrote poems with overheard lines, and we love to share them and so forth. So those are all it's a completely natural genre, I think, to Szymborska, who took such pleasure in everyday life.
Białaszewski did it too, and I just found out from talking to Michał Rusinek at the Szymborska Institute. We're working on Białaszewski together, and Szymborska adored Białaszewski, and Białaszewski was somebody who would take, he didn't do avant-garde neologism so much as just listen to malapropisms on the street, So so that's part of that same genre. Everyday life is part of the fabric of poetry, both in language and in reality.
There's one poem that we were thinking of looking at where she talks directly about the stuff of narrative, which is consolation, which seems to be a compilation. This is a later poem, a much later poem, which seems to be a compilation of like all the genres, like of Dickens or the 19th century realist novel, kind of listed in one poem. Let's see if I can find that.
It's on 362 in map.
I have my notes. Yeah,
it is a compendium of the tropes of the 19th century British novel specifically, and she says
of which she was a great admirer, right? I mean, didn't she say everybody should have Dickens on their shelf? And
she said one time she said, in passing in one of her non-required reading texts, the little prose texts, I translated some of them that she used to write in Pickwick Papers. And then she says, and if you haven't read Pickwick Papers, I don't even want to speak to you. She loved Pickwick Papers. She loved Dickens. She said, I preferred Dickens to Dostoevsky in one of her famous Liszt poems. And one time I even asked her at some dinner party or something, I asked her if she liked Trollope, because I guessed she would be a Trollope kind of lady. And she was, she loved Trollope. So that's what this one is about, 19th century narrative, because Darwin, of course, too, the creator of one of the great 19th century narratives we're still living with today, the idea of evolution, which in turn inflected Marxism in its Leninist variant, that we're evolving into higher levels of being. Consolation, Darwin. They say he read novels to relax, but only certain kinds, nothing that ended unhappily. If he happened on something like that, enraged, he flung the book into the fire. True or not, I'm ready to believe it. Scanning in his mind so many times and places, he'd had enough of dying species, the triumphs of the strong, of the weak, the endless struggles to survive, all doomed sooner or later. He'd earned the right to happy endings, at least in fiction, with its microscales. Hence the indispensable silver lining. The lovers reunited, the families reconciled, the doubts dispelled, fidelity rewarded, fortunes regained, treasures uncovered, stiff-necked neighbors mending their ways, good names restored, greed daunted, old maids married off to worthy parsons, troublemakers banished to other hemispheres, forgers of documents tossed down the stairs, seducers scurrying to the altar, orphans sheltered, widows comforted, pride humbled, wounds healed, prodigal sons summoned home, cups of sorrow tossed into the ocean, hankies drenched with tears of reconciliation, general merriment and celebration, and the dog Fido, gone astray in the first chapter, turns up barking gladly in the last. So all the tropes of the novel turned into a giant poetic list, one of her specialties. It's not about one narrative, it's about a kind of narrative. Everything works out the way it should, everyone you want to see get rewarded gets rewarded. The people who need a little bit of a comeuppance get it. Something, the illegitimate child is acknowledged. Everything works out. Maybe a dog died somewhere along the line. I don't know. But Downton Abbey was so gratifying because you knew nothing truly horrible would happen in this world and nothing that nobody would actually have their life destroyed over,
And it was the problem with socialist realism is that everything always came out to tell, reality in its revolutionary development, right? I mean,
right,
the same story.
Well, the same story, except it's not revolutionary development. It's resolution in a way. It's not saying we're moving forward into a better future. It's saying everything will work out okay. Mm-hmm. They'll get to keep the abbey. The servants will all want to stay on, even if they can leave. Everything. The Queen will come and visit you in the movie sequel. I mean, I watched, or the King, whoever it was. I watched it all. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that happy ending, she's also celebrating like this human capacity to create more than one kind of story. Darwin is imagining all these bitter endings, species die out, mutations don't survive, dying species, the strong of the weak, sort of one cliche, struggles to survive. We create another kind of story, and that's another kind of truth going on too, and the two of them coexist. And then, of course, Darwin, as I said, a great creator of narrative. It's no accident that he was 19th century and British.
Another curious aspect of Szymborska is her fascination with kitsch, there was a period where she had this kind of secret romance with the Polish boxer Andrzej Gołota, which her friends, they loved this. They created a whole event around kind of a private event with the people in her circle and her friends, about Andrzej Gołota. And I think Andrzej Gołota, after her death, wrote a poem to Szymborska.
That I didn't even know, but that's wonderful.
If I'm not mistaken, I think so. But it's something that runs deep. I mean, like these big lumbering figures like Gołota or the Yeti, or she has a poem on bodybuilders, and then she compares herself to a boxer in this other great poem. Can we look at the one called Poetry Reading?
Sure. Let me find that one.
87 in
that's one that's one kind of kitsch she really hates, is the kitsch surrounding poetry. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, I'm going to do one tiny bit of product placement, but I've wanted to translate this for years and years. It's from her, what was called in Polish, Poczta Literacka. It's coming out in a month. This column that she wrote anonymously for many years in Życie Literackie, anonymously because she was the only woman on the staff, and you can't get away with hiding your gender in Polish grammar, as you know.
Right.
So she wrote them all anonymously, but part of what she does is to give one sentence example of a letter she writes to a would-be author, she says, "Perhaps you could try loving in prose." Every cliche of the love lyric, every cliche of what it means, she's always deflating them. She's always, or take off the wings and try riding on foot. So it's that the cliches of being a poet, she absolutely rejects time and again. So let's turn to that poem. Yeah, and boxing and poetry matches. Poetry reading. To be a boxer or not to be there at all. Oh, muse, where are our teeming crowds? 12 people in the room, 8 seats to spare. It's time to start this cultural affair. Half came inside because it started raining. The rest are relatives. Oh, muse. The women here would love to rant and rave, but that's for boxing. Here they must behave. Dante's Inferno is ringside nowadays. Likewise is Paradise. Oh, muse. Oh, not to be a boxer, but a poet. One sentenced to hard shellying for life. For lack of muscles forced to show the world the sonnet that may make the high school reading lists with luck. Oh, muse. Oh, bob-tailed angel Pegasus. In the first row, a sweet old man's soft snore. He dreams his wife's alive again. What's more, she's making him that tart she used to bake. A flame, but carefully. Don't burn his cake. We start to read. Oh, muse.
What's the original for shellying?
I would have to look that up, and I don't have it right here. It's a Polish poet, but I can't remember. Oh, the Ciężkie Norwide. That's what it is. Ciężkie Norwide, hard Norwid.
Norwid.
But obviously, Norwid is not going to come across to an English audience. So this is what Stanisław and I always did, and I continue to do. You find something that will resonate the same way for an English language audience. Yeah. Ciężkie Norwide. I'd forgotten all about that until just this moment. Yeah.
I mean, you have to wonder about, like, I mean, she talks about, another thing that she mentions in the Nobel lecture is that ultimately the poet, for whatever their public persona is, and no doubt she's thinking of, really flamboyant, early, kind of modernist poets, maybe Mayakovsky, people like that, that ultimately you have to sit there and stare at the blank page and do the thing that's gonna last. And this is the show. This is the dog and pony show.
Yeah.
That
the dog and pony show
that poets have to do.
Sentenced to hard shellying. Of course, it's a joke, it's a pun, and Ciężkie Norwide is like something Mayakovsky would do, actually, or an avant-garde poet, early Alexander Watt or something, or Yashensky. But it is hard shellying. That's what she's saying, in the Nobel lecture where she says, the reason we're unphotogenic is you can't sit there and show Chopin, pounding away at the piano or something. You want someone lie on a sofa, get up, write a line, throw it in the trash, lie down again for another 2 hours. You die of boredom. And by all accounts, she threw out most of what she wrote. And that's what she tells people in her advice to do all the time too. She says, with all the passion of youth, words flow like a torrent from an avalanche in spring. Try chewing your pencil and staring out the window in despair from now and then. Here it is hard shellying, and that's not what's showing up on stage. Doesn't she say in some other one about she comes clumping on in heavy boots or something somewhere?
Yeah.
Instead of coming on with angel wings, I can't remember which one it is, but there's another one right on the next page that's her turning poetry on its head all over again. There's this long tradition going back to Horace of the poet, I built myself a monument, I made myself a monument not raised by human hands. She does exactly the opposite. She's saying here, as still quite a young woman, epitaph, here lies old-fashioned as parentheses, the authoress of verse. Eternal rest was granted her by earth, although the corpse had failed to join the avant-garde, of course. The plain grave, there's poetic justice in it, this ditty dirge, the owl, the burdock. Passerby, take out your compact compubrain and try to weigh Szymborska's fate for half a minute. That she's not going to do the self-glorification, my verse will last through eternity, stop here and meditate on the tragedies of fate or whatever.
Non omnis moriar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She's kind of saying she's an authoress, so she's
Yeah.
making fun of being poetica, which is something that people wrote about periodically with her. The corpse had failed to join the avant-garde. Her life isn't even worth recounting. And somebody with, she's prefiguring iPods or whatever, iPads, whatever.
Yeah, this is pretty early to be talking about like mobile devices, isn't it?
Yeah,
Which collection is this from?
I think
Salt,
it's
1962.
1962. So she's looking at herself through the angle of a future that does not include a passerby with a book or a passerby who's enamored of poetry. It's somebody who can't take his face off the precursor of the iPhone.
Yeah, Lem wrote about some kind of the prefiguration of a Kindle or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that was before 1962. It might not have been.
Well, I think she really liked Lem too. And one of her things she enjoys is science fiction because it makes you imagine outside of the human perspective, which is both necessary and impossible. The Yeti kind of prefigures, she has 6 or 7 poems that are written from the point of view of visitors from outer space or angels. What do we look like to them? We know what beetles and dogs and cats look like to us. What do we look like to some projected higher form of life?
And both Lem and Szymborska are Krakowianers, right?
Oh, yeah.
So were they close? Did you know? Did they?
That I really couldn't say. I should look it up because this is a good year to be thinking about Lem.
Along the lines of her love for kitsch and kitsch objects, and people would give her things. I think her favorite thing was it a cigarette dispenser, or a cigarette lighter, or something like that? She had.
What was it? A little bear that pushed out the cigarettes, and
I thought it was like a bird or something that plucked them up.
Something like that, because I remember. I think it might have been Jurek Ilk, one of her publishers,
right,
who gave it to her, and he was really proud. I may be mangling the story a bit because she said if her house went on fire, she would grab the cigarette lighter and take it out with her. Everybody was competing to give her kitsch, but then she regifted the kitsch you gave her too, so that you would have these parties where she had a lottery and you would win a prize. And at first I remember being mortally offended mildly offended, because I saw things that I'd given her showing up on other people's shelves. But then I realized that's part of the whole, I'm sure I got gifts that other people had given her. I gave her an Audubon loon figure that made a loon cry when you squeezed it. And she was enamored of it at the moment, but then I saw the Audubon loon on somebody else's shelf later on, whatever,
Right.
Yeah.
She sent you these wonderful postcards.
Yeah.
And you sent me scans so we can show them on the show. There's this one with these sumo wrestlers with the caption "Zdecydowane I zmysłowy," which means determined and sensual.
and yeah, with the sumo wrestler with his sumo posterior facing and it's another kitsch, like what you were saying. It's like the wrestlers and boxers and Yeti, another one of those kinds of.
Another one, and I also love this one, which happens to be in the same file. So when she sent these, was the content this picture with the image, or was that on one side and was there a letter on the other side? Or?
No, she didn't. With me at least, she didn't write letters, and I don't think she wrote letters regularly. The postcard, I mean, her volumes of correspondence have been coming out recently. If I move my head, you can see some of them up there on the shelf. But what she did a lot was just write a few words on the back. And if she wrote more than a few words, I would just be thrilled. When she actually wrote something one time she responded to something that I'd written that came out in the journal Texty Drugie, and she wrote how much she liked it. Oh my gosh, this is like Emily Dickinson, coming back from the grave and writing some enigmatic thing, but they like something you wrote for a change. or when am I coming back to Kraków? And every time that happened, I just felt like jumping over the moon. But usually it was something very sweet and something very, very short. And she collected these huge files of catalogs and old newspapers and journals and magazines. And as you can see from the images you've seen, she cut them out really meticulously. This was like a second form of creation for her, and collaged them together in these various ways.
Yeah, I mean, it raises the question of whether the poems are, especially with these found object, bits of language, things that are overheard, they're also kind of collages in some cases.
Very much so. That overhearing comments at a funeral. She has one
Right.
like that. Yeah.
This is another one that I love. That's she has it, but she's not showing it.
Yeah.
Ma ale nie pokaże, right? I mean, that's totally Szymborska.
Right. She's got it, but she's not going to. She's got it, but she don't flaunt it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And what was, since we talked about this with Zagajewski, what was your working relationship with Szymborska? I mean, when you only met her right in Stockholm when she won the Nobel Prize, but you'd been translating her for years before then.
For years, and she was one of the first poet. She was really the first poet that Stanisław and I were working on an anthology from back when I was a graduate student. And she was the first poet we both kind of just got obsessed with and couldn't stop. And that's why we decided we just had to keep going. And so that would have been the early 80s. And I didn't meet her until Stockholm. I was scared silly. Stanisław couldn't go because of his health. She surrounded herself, typical Szymborska. What I always joked is like a garage band wins the Grammy. All her friends, there was no PR, there was no one looking at, she didn't have minders or anything like that. Nobody wanted, just a little group of friends. And I was absolutely terrified because I thought I'd open my mouth, I'd make some mistake in Polish, and everybody would say, oh my God, and this is the woman who's translating our Nobel laureate. But what she did instead.
All of our constant fear.
Yes, exactly. You're going to be busted. Somebody will take away your poetic license. You're done, your translator license. But having that fear be activated when you're walking into a room full of strangers who are all her good friends, chattering away, and the room happens to be the Nobel laureate room in the Grand Hotel in Stockholm. I was just scared out of my mind. And the first thing she was doing, I think the meeting had already, all her friends were sitting around on the floor, just hanging out. She was having everybody collect a pile of objects to pick what she should steal from the hotel room. So it was classic kitsch, like a shoehorn, washcloth, whatever. So I forget what she actually picked, but then I was just supposed to start snooping around her room and her suite, and find, the best ballpoint pen or whatever for her to steal when she left. So the kitsch and the self-deprecation, and also do not take this event seriously, otherwise I'm out of here, sort of persona.
Right. I mean, it's all often, I think, either she or Rushinek called it the Nobel catastrophe, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the Nobel tragedy, the Nobel catastrophe, because she didn't write for, the 6 years, really a long time after that. It paralyzed her. And I remember it might have been Michał Rushinek who told me that how happy she was when the next Nobel Prize came out, because then she was no longer this year's Nobel laureate. She was yesterday's Nobel laureate.
Thinking about those poems that, since then that she, those later poems, one thing that strikes me is how, in many ways, I think that Szymborska is as well known to Americans, who don't necessarily read poetry in the way that Poles, traditionally, at least up till recently, have been reading poetry, and maybe still to some extent. that she's as well known, if not more so, than any American poet, here in translation. I think, and like through poems, like The Cat in an Empty Apartment, things like that appeared on the subway in New York and in various cities. That those are that they've become part of our lexicon. I think,
in a really surprising way, the time I really saw that sort of upfront. Part of it, I was seeing it very early on because people couldn't write to her, and she got the Nobel Prize after email was pretty well established. She never learned to use email, which was another self-protective, and rightly so. You don't want to be a Nobel laureate getting your inbox flooded, especially if you're reclusive and a private person. I would get them I remember getting something from a veterinarian about how well she understood the psychic life of pets. And a friend of mine's father was, I forget what it's called, a hydrophysicist or something. And he used her poem about water to illustrate points in his classes. And lots of people saying, I never read poetry, but somebody gave me this book, or I picked up this book, and this is the one book I'll read. And after she died, I got asked to write something about her, and I couldn't. I was too upset. So I did web searches and found all the blogs and websites and everything. And it was like Billy and Bob's music shop, or someone saying, I love opera, and this is the poem I give to my friends, her opera singer poem or something, coloratura. And if they don't get this poem, they're not going to be my friends. Or it's just people from the widest range, as people saying, I always thought I would just go to Krakow from wherever I'm living in Brooklyn or Missouri or wherever. I'd go there and just put a bunch of flowers on her door front and then run away because I knew she wouldn't really want to meet me. And now I would have to go and put them on her grave, and I can't stand it. One of them even quoted her Nobel lecture from Ecclesiastes, where she says, Ecclesiastes, what are you talking about? Nothing new under the sun. She said that she called her speech the Movadotup, the speech for she hated writing it. She was not a proclamation person. And she said, I killed one prose sketch and one poem to write that Nobel lecture. And I think the poem would have been about Ecclesiastes. That's what it seemed like to me, because she says he's one of the greatest poets. And you said there is nothing new under the sun, but you, Ecclesiastes, are something new under the sun. And this person, whoever they were, in some place I didn't know, said, you too were something new under the sun, and now your death is new under the sun, and I have to learn to live with that. All these people who never met her, you can read through the whole volume and find out she had a sister, she had parents. They're love poems that are usually very oblique, elegies for lost dear ones, also very oblique. And yet people felt like she was someone they knew and loved. And I think you're right. There's some paradox about the need for privacy is what enabled her to connect personally through the poems. I don't know quite how she did it, but she did.
I remember very vividly when she died, because I was working at the Polish Cultural Institute. I was in charge of literature and humanities. We'd gotten word that she'd passed kind of early in the morning. It was like middle of the night, something like that in New York. And so we'd all been emailing each other saying, all right, well, we've got to do something, since it's Szymborska. And so, I walk in the office, and the New York Times is on the phone and wants to talk to me, and I haven't taken my coat off yet because they're working on the obit, and all of the obits, it seems, that came out at that time were mostly from the time that she won. They were written mostly when she won the Nobel Prize, and they were like static and stagnant, and it was very hard to break through that form that they had. I mean, they had the political controversy, they had the Nobel Prize, but not much that happened since. I remember there were quotes that were attributed to other people that were mine, and there were quotes that were, that were not mine, that were attributed to me, but it didn't matter. It was all right. It was, it was tolerable, but it was, it was something that, like, suddenly, that's what consumed our day, in the next several days after that was answering the queries, and because she was important to Americans, I think.
And is. I'm for me, it's one of the most gratifying things. People can't write to Szymborska now for obvious reasons, but even then they couldn't write to her directly, and she wouldn't have wanted them to. And I was sort of the go-between, and it happens with Zagajewski too, not quite in the same way, but that people write me and thank me for helping them have access to this person. You just like, wow, somebody I never met and never will meet somewhere loved this poem and this poet so much that they actually dropped me a line. And I used to save them and send them to her through Micha Rushinek, just so she would know that these people out, God knows where, were picking up her book in, North Dakota or, Arizona, places that to her were just funny names.
Something else, that struck me as I was like looking through map, and because of course, being a reader and an academic, I always look at the acknowledgments, that delighted and struck me was your acknowledgement of Drenka Willen, who discovered
Drenka Willen. Yeah, Drenka is still one of my favorite people on the planet, where she looks pretty much at everything I translate. And Drenka, it was all handled through Stanisław back then. I was still the graduate student, or immediate past tense, graduate student. And Stanisław was the one who knew people, and he showed our translations to Charles Simic, who worked with Drenka at Harcourt Brace. And
Drenka was the editor who acquired, as they say, Szymborska, Umberto Eco, Stanisław Lem, Jose Saramago, so many.
Published some Grass. She'd been to the Nobel Prize so many times,
Calvino.
Yeah. And anyhow, Drenka loved the poems, and she's kind of convinced the people at Harcourt, because it's a big business, and now it's mainly a big business, but then it had this very strong literature, fine writing imprimatur, and she was in charge of that. And she kind of convinced them to take on this poet nobody knew, with a funny name, with a Z and a line through her L and all of this stuff. And I remember, not to get all, Stanisław never made a public appearance with me about Szymborska's poems. He was never well enough, and he was self-conscious. Even when he was feeling well, he never knew when he was. So we won the Penn Prize in translation, and I went down to pick it up. I went up to New York to pick it up, and Drenka was so thrilled. She said, "This will prove to them it's already sold 4,000 copies. If it can just keep selling 1,000 copies a year, I'll have proved to the accountants upstairs that it was worth acquiring this title." So the Nobel Prize, partly, I just felt like, yay, Drenka. And she is the most meticulous and at the same time truly literary editor on the planet, and the loveliest human being too. So yeah, the most recent Szymborska, again, my little placement thing, is actually
this new book that you're working on is called How to Start Writing and When to Stop. That's this one?
That I'm already done, but Drenka went through the whole thing with me during the pandemic, when my brain, And it's dedicated to Drinka. I dedicated the translation to Drinka I forced her to let me. I said, you're going to make me deeply unhappy if you don't do that, because she hates it when she gets fussed over, which is one reason why I suppose she loves Szymborska so much.
I could see that she has a lot in common with
Yes.
Szymborska. I've met Drinka a number of times, and
of course, you're in New York.
Yeah, in New York, and the last time I saw her, she'd invited me over for coffee, and we were talking about like the future of translation and poetry and literature, like substantial literature, and it was her opinion that the big publishers aren't going to do it anymore, that it's going to be the small presses who pick up the works, and which is what we're seeing for the last 10-15 years, and if they have commercial potential, then the large publishers will buy the rights from smaller publishers, but now, somebody's, being a big editor at a big press isn't like being like her. She had a chance to be a pioneer.
And create. She was sort of a magnet for these excellent writers, that she was publishing Charles Simic, Nobel laureate, for a U.S. poet laureate, not Nobel laureate, poet laureate and Pulitzer Prize winner and everything else. And he was friends with Stanisław, and he liked them, and he brought them to her. That was the kind of person she was. One person would be drawn to her, and that person would draw other people in.
Maybe we should talk about Cat in an Empty Apartment, because it's such a popular poem, a poem that's been reproduced in public transportation, and things that people see that just enables people to connect to Szymborska, because of its description of something entirely familiar, and yet from a distance.
Entirely familiar, and yet something we don't think about, we don't look at, and it enabled them to connect to her. And I'll just mention one other thing, but she's not in the poem. And I'll mention at the end what I think is lying behind the poem, but it's not in the poem. Cat in an Empty Apartment. Die. You can't do that to a cat. Since what can a cat do in an empty apartment? Climb the walls? Rub up against the furniture? Nothing seems different here, but nothing is the same. Nothing is moved, but there's more space. And at nighttime, no lamps are lit. Footsteps on the staircase, but they're new ones. The hand that puts fish on the saucer has changed too. Something doesn't start at its usual time. Something doesn't happen as it should. Someone was always here, then suddenly disappeared, and stubbornly stays disappeared. Every closet has been examined. Every shelf has been explored. Excavations under the carpet turned up nothing. A commandment was even broken, papers scattered everywhere. What remains to be done? Just sleep and wait. Just wait till he turns up. Just let him show his face. Will he ever get a lesson on what not to do to a cat? Sidle toward him as if unwilling, and ever so slow on visibly offended paws, and no leaps or squeals, at least to start. Well, it's another one of the things that happens in her, always using a point of view you don't expect and making you see things that are around you from an angle you never thought to look at before. Pets also experience death, but how do they experience it? And that's kind of the question that sets the poem in motion. But I'm also going to mention one other thing. When Stanisław and I did the first volume that Drinka picked up, selected poems called View with a Grain of Sand, we wanted to call it Cat in an Empty Apartment. And she said no, because the poem was too personal. And that clues you in this, as far as I can see, and I would never have said this to her, it's the death of her own partner. that lies behind this and a number of other poems here. And the person who suddenly enters into the cat's perspective is the person who's coming to feed the cat after the cat's owner. Will he ever get a lesson, is no longer there. So this is kind of the backstory to the poem. I'm not going to extrapolate on her personal life, but somebody is feeding the cat of somebody they lost. Why else would they even be feeding the cat? Someone important to them, watching the cat's behavior when they come and bring the food in, and then maybe sticking around a little bit, or imagining what the cat does after the food has been laid out and you go away. So she's trying, it's grief. There's human grief behind here, but it's human grief trying to say, my grief is not the only grief. What does grief feel like to a cat? Because all of these things are different. The cat is analyzing in the poem. Something doesn't start, something doesn't happen, but she's intentionally leaving words out because the cat doesn't know who the someone, they don't have a name for the person. And then she says one thing here that I really love, because it's part of what she does, that her exploration of being human is saying, let's consider what we look like to someone else. Let's consider what the beings around see us as. Here, there's excavations under the carpet turned up nothing. A commandment was even broken. Well, what's that about? It's, in the first hand, it's somebody who, a writer, a desk, paper scattered everywhere. That's what cats do. I mean, if you have a cat and a computer, you know that cat loves your keyboard more than it ever loved you. They're going to be up there. They're going to be fooling around. So the cat has been told a million times not to mess with the papers. Shoo, get off. Do what pisses the person off and see if the person will come. Well, that's what we do, step in a crack, break your mother's back, all these superstitions, or I violate a law, is God going to come and get me? I broke a commandment. So she's saying they are experiencing a hierarchy in the world and an order in the world that has been radically disrupted by death. How do they react? And at the very end, of course, the cat doesn't know the person has died. And she writes about this in one of her little pieces in Non-Required Reading, which also has a lot of kitsch books, because what do people actually read? She obviously was picking up books off the remaindered shelf, and one book that she writes a little piece about was what to do when your dog gets sick. And she says, we treat it as something enchanting, when you get home from the vacation and the dog pees on the carpet and goes around in circles and is jumping up. She said, your Lazarus just come back from the dead. You haven't been able to send your dog a postcard. You haven't been able to do any of those things. And so the cat doesn't know, but it's also a human impulse. Somebody you love dies and you think all of these magical ways to bring them back. It's not really true, all the stages of grief, that denial, all of this other stuff, but trying to keep it from this point of view. It's not her loss, it's the cat's loss that she's sort of paying tribute to. It's I think quite extraordinary. And this is
erasing her own loss.
It's erasing or sharing her own loss. That it's not confined to her. And it's also about, as to circle back to the beginning, about as un-Stalinist, as un-Marxist-Leninist as this is not the great man. This is the little creatures living their lives, losing people, losing things. There's a whole story in this poem that's not a story anybody would pay attention to, except the person who puts the fish on the plate for the cat, the most trivial thing you can think of.
We can see why that poem has just captured so many people's imaginations. Thanks so much for being on the show again, and we'll have to do yet another one at some point in the not too distant future.
Well, it's just a blast doing them with you, David. I mean, you can edit that out if you want, but it's so much fun. I'm sorry Hawaii's so far away.
It's good that we have a chance to talk about literature, which
I
happens
know.
so little in academia, right? I mean, we
Right.
worry about the department meetings. We worry about, like, now everybody's talking about how am I going to manage teaching during the
Right.
pandemic and all that.
Yeah.
Um,
That's what's preoccupying me this week because classes start next week. Yeah.
right. But this is a chance to take some time aside to talk about what we really do, which is
Yeah. And also, what translators really do is sit there and obsess over other people's words.
don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications about new videos from the Polish Cultural Institute in New York. Go to the Polish Cultural Institute's website, linked in the description below, to see a full schedule of upcoming episodes. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. Our sponsor, the Polish Cultural Institute New York, directed by Robert Czaniawski. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, suggested this series and acts as our executive producer. My fellow producer, Natalia Iudin, handles all the video editing, technical, and aesthetic aspects of this production. Klaudia Ofłona-Draber, head of communications at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, keeps us all informed about upcoming episodes of Encounters with Polish Literature and other events organized by the Polish Cultural Institute New York. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month, when we'll be talking about Poland's national poet from the Romantic period, recognized as a great European intellectual in his own day, Adam Mickiewicz, the author of Pan Tadeusz, recently translated by Bill Johnston, the drama Forefathers' Eve, which has again become a subject of political controversy recently, and many lyric poems which will be on the agenda with Mickiewicz biographer Professor Roman Koropecki from University of California, Los Angeles. See you then.